And once again, I'm Pastor Steve Cook. I serve on the Synod staff as one of your Synod ministers, and it's my pleasure to present my colleague, Pastor Heather Culuris, who serves as the Synod Minister for Equipping Congregations. Heather, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am Pastor Heather, about 4 months in on the Synod staff. And one of the ways that this presentation took shape is by meeting with some congregations who were going through the call process and saying, we want to start off on the best foot possible. In fact, one of our call committees said, we need advice on how to start off on the best foot. And so I started to think about that and then did this presentation in the congregation that had requested thinking about starting off on the best foot together with their pastor. And so this has come as the fruit of that conversation. Now, some of these things as I go through are fairly simple things, but sometimes things that we forget in the rush of calling a pastor and getting the call vote together and getting them moved in. And so some of these things are just good reminders for all of us on how to build a steady foundation. So I'm going to go into full screen with the presentation, and then from there we'll keep going. So as we think about pastor and congregation relationships, I asked the congregation that I was visiting with to think about some positive, the maybe most positive relationship they've had with a pastor, and also to think about a difficult relationship they've had. And in most of our congregations, for most of our pastors, there are some relationships that have gone very well, and there are some that we know get bumpy. And so to think about for yourself in your congregational history, in your own personal history, when were those times that things were really positive? And when were the times that things did get a little bumpy? And as we build that, it's a two-way relationship, and it's really building a path forward together. So as we think about this right now in our synod, we are averaging around 50 openings in our congregations for churches who are looking to start new relationships with newly called pastors. And so it really is walking the path together. And some of you, as you have come on, have talked about the places you are in your call journey. So some of you have talked about, as you came onto this call, working to get your ministry site profiles together, or interims. And your journey really with your future pastor begins with that ministry site profile that you send into the synod that we then pass on to pastors, and portraying yourself as you are, authentically, but also with grace. How you do your ministry site profile is so important to that relationship that you build with your future pastor. Being honest, being authentically you, having a good sense of your gifts as a congregation, and also the gifts you need from your pastor. So where does that path take you? Some of you are on this path right now, where you've just put in your ministry site profiles, and you're hoping in the future that you will see names of pastors that you can interview and that you can begin a journey with. And so from the ministry site profile, your journey of pastor and congregation continues through your call committee and your candidate. And so if you think about the people who are on your call committees, or the people you might appoint to your call committees, they are really the first view of your congregation that a pastor sees, and how important that is as they interact with the candidates who might be your pastors, but also as that candidate learns about your congregation. Those of you who are in the call process right now know that from the call committee, there's a presentation to the council and then a call vote. And so that's where this process really begins, and all of those points are so important. And there's small things you can do that significantly, even this early, strengthen your relationship as a pastor and a congregation. If you think about, for those of you who are parents or grandparents, sending a child off to school, right, for the first day of school, and we pack their backpacks full of everything they need, their pencils, their markers, the best lunch we can think about. And small things on those first days can significantly change how things are perceived and how the year goes. So starting with welcome, some ideas to welcome your new pastor. As your pastor moves in, your welcome is incredibly important. In my last call, I tell the story about a call committee chair who, when we moved in with a kindergartner, was a fourth grade teacher. And his room was right next to my kindergartner's room. And every day for the rest of that year, we moved there in January, the call committee chair, fourth grade teacher, welcomed my daughter by name and said good morning to her every single morning for the rest of the school year. And so that kind of a welcome spoke volumes. So thinking about ideas to welcome your new pastor, and this isn't an exhaustive list, it's just some places to think. Installation services, how you celebrate officially as Pastor Steve or I or Bishop D come to have that moment of official welcome, where you make promises to your future pastor and they make promises to you. The installation service is an important moment to stop and recognize and celebrate. And so is the celebration after that or before that, where you have fellowship time to get to know each other. As we've talked to some pastors and colleagues who moved calls during COVID, one of the things that congregations and pastors have missed was that moment to celebrate together or to really have a reception and get to know each other in that moment. Maybe it's cake that you have, maybe it's a potluck. One of our congregations recently, and a few of you are on this call, had fresh mini donuts at their reception for their pastor. So a unique way to welcome and celebrate. Introduce yourself by name repeatedly. There's that awkward moment about 6 months into any pastor's call where they realize they may not know everyone's name. And now it feels a little awkward to say, I'm not sure who you are. Can you tell me your name again? And so introduce yourself by name repeatedly, especially in times where some of the time you may be meeting folks, you might be on Zoom, like in the call process, or you might be masked. I've been joking that my 12-year-old son, I may not recognize some of his friends. We moved here during COVID and they were still masking at school and basketball games. And so I've met a lot of little 12-year-old boys whose masks have covered their face, their baseball cap covered the top of their head, and they all look really similar to me right now. So introduce yourself by name and maybe by how you're connected. Another way to welcome your pastor is to bring food to your pastor's family or even gift cards to introduce them to community businesses, the places you frequent, the places you love, the places you hope maybe they'll frequent too. Help your pastor's family to connect in the community. We notice sometimes that pastors are happiest when their families are also happy and settled. And so if your pastor's spouse loves quilting, help them connect with quilting. Your pastor's spouse loves playing cribbage, help them find a cribbage group to play with. Your pastor's family loves the outdoors. I know of a church that actually gave state park passes to their pastor as the pastor moved in to encourage them to explore the parks around the area. But help your pastor's family to connect and feel at home. And then introduce them and make connections with the community leaders. Maybe that's at school with the superintendent or the principal, the teachers. Maybe that's walking them through the hospital so they know the layout of the hospital, taking them to the city offices, maybe connecting with the police. Over the time of my pastorate, some of the people that I have both reached out to for a sense of the community and as a gut check on my ministry have been some of these other community leaders. And so as you bring your new pastor to introduce them, it's easier than them making a cold call and just saying, hi, I'm the new pastor here. But it also shows that you are excited that they are starting with you and that you're excited about this new time together. Some more ideas on welcoming. Make sure your pastor has the tools to have a strong start. The lists of who to visit, where are the keys, what are the passwords to get into the computer? I was talking to one church that talked about their spare keys, but even some of their leadership didn't know where they were. And so trying to get those together for the pastor. Thinking of who to visit. As pastors move in, there may be a list already of shut-ins or people that they should check in with, passing that along right away with any knowledge that you have. The passwords to the computers or to email are really helpful. Making sure you know those before the pastor comes in and spends a month trying to figure out, how do I get into the Sundays and Seasons subscription? Or how do I get into the pastor's email? Communicate your expectations as the congregation, and don't expect them to be something your pastor can be a mind reader on. So things like office hours, some congregations have them, need them, expect them. Some, just as long as their pastor is accessible, are fine with that. If you're one of those churches that would like your pastor to have office hours, communicate that as they start so that you're not upset about it with each other later. Perhaps talk about the frequency of visits, whether that's visiting shut-ins monthly, or if you have a committee and so the pastor can get around once quarterly, those kinds of things. Involvement with committees. Which committees does your pastor play a role in? Which committees would you like them to play a role in? Which committees work well, perhaps without needing that extra support? But to communicate your expectations as someone starts, just so they can know what you would like from them. And it makes it easier 6 months, 12 months down the road. Another one is to be the interpreters of your community and your congregation. Each community has its own traditions, has its own important holidays, its own things that are vital to the core and character of who you are. And so does every congregation. In my first call, one of my biggest mistakes was at Christmas. And I had asked for 3 months, what songs does everyone sing on Christmas Eve? I grew up in a church that ended Christmas Eve with Joy to the World. So no one ever told me, though I asked, what songs do we sing on Christmas Eve? And I ended Christmas Eve worship with Joy to the World. Everyone walked out of church crying because their new pastor had ruined Christmas, because they sang Silent Night. So be the interpreters of your community and congregation for the pastor. Help them know the places that it's important for them to be present. Help them know if there's a tradition that it would be really useful for them to be a part of. Then get to know your pastor as a person. Often we expect our pastors to know us well, to know our names, to know what we do, to know what our hobbies are, to know where we live. And sometimes we don't make that a mutual knowing of the other person. And so to get to know your pastor as a person, do they play guitar? Do they go fishing? Do they like to crochet? What's important to them? Do they have family that live out of state? And maybe you ask about those folks. But get to know your pastor as a person, as much as they might allow you to. And to recognize sometimes there might be things they don't share. But some of those pieces like Pastor Heather loves chocolate, or Pastor Chris plays cribbage, or Pastor Steve is musical, those kinds of things. It's just nice to share those connections and know about each other. Another piece is to encourage your pastor to build relationships with colleagues in the area and go to professional events. So things like Synod Assembly, which are required as part of a pastor's call. Encourage your pastor to do that each year. Things like Fall Theological in September or early October. Encourage them to go. It is also a required event for them, but encourage them to go. Things like monthly conference meetings for rostered leaders. Each of our congregations is in a conference, and the group of leaders meets monthly to support each other, to worship together, sometimes to do education together. Encourage them to go. Sometimes it's easy to think the drive is too long or I have too much to do. Encourage your pastor to connect with those groups. Also, area text studies where pastors meet and talk about the text for the Sunday can be a great support, especially to solo pastors who end up working alone a lot. Also, community ministeriums, those ecumenical groups that may plan community services or baccalaureate or those kinds of things. Encourage your pastor to connect so they don't feel that that's a burden to you that they do that. So here's a language question for you. Do we call or do we hire our pastors? And sometimes we hear congregations saying both. But in the Lutheran system, we are calling a pastor, which is different than simply hiring an employee. And so that idea of call, it's a mutual relationship based in God's work in our lives. God is calling your pastor to serve you. God is calling your congregation to be a place where your pastor serves. It's a mutual relationship, and it's a mutual covenant. It is one of those pieces where we make promises to each other, and you hear those in the installation service. It's a mutual covenant, binding promises between you as a congregation and your pastor, and it's a spiritual, faith-based partnership. It's not simply a secular relationship that's easily ended. And we know that pastors and congregations who take this seriously, that it's a call to each other, it's a covenant, it's a promise, pastors and congregations do better together as they look at ministry that way. Here's the other question. Where is our perfect pastor? Kind of like perfect spouse, there may be a perfect for you pastor, but I can assure you, especially from my experience of ministry in my life, there are no perfect pastors. Pastors are human, with their mistakes, with their own things they are not quite as good at, with their gifts. Every pastor is human. And here's the other question. Where is the perfect congregation? All of yours, right? But congregations are also made up of humans. And so congregations still have their own quirks, their own strengths, their own gifts, their own mistakes. All pastors will at some point make a mistake. Even the pastor you've called with high hopes that they will be your perfect pastor, someday they will make a mistake. Someday they might disappoint you. Someday you might have to have a difficult conversation. And all congregations make mistakes. You may say something one day to your pastor at a council meeting that causes a misunderstanding. There might be something that happens when a member of your congregation posts something on Facebook. All congregations, all pastors make mistakes. And it's not about perfection. It's about relationship and growth in faith together, not perfection. At one point, as I was doing premarital counseling, I read something about it's not, does your spouse leave their socks on the floor? The question is, do you love them enough to see past those moments and to stay together and make it work? And your perfect pastor will make some mistakes. There will be times you have to talk to each other in ways that lead towards healing and reconciliation. And it's about growth and faith together, not about perfection. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever made it through a worship service perfect. And so it probably happens on a Sunday, even all the time. So some steps to have a positive pastor-congregational relationship. All of our churches have constitutions, and our constitutions lay out the roles of the pastor and the council. It's important to know those and to follow those, and just pay attention to those as you go forward. Also, some of our congregations may have a history of conflict, either with one pastor in their past or sometimes with repeated pastors. And if you're in that place before you're calling a new pastor, it's a great time to look seriously at why it occurs and work to break the pattern. And so if you're sitting in a congregation and you've maybe had one difficult relationship with the pastor, to look at that carefully and to say, how can we move forward in a better fashion? If it repeats on a regular basis, it's an even better time to look at, why does this happen? What goes on in our dynamic that makes it difficult, that makes it bumpy, that leads to maybe a short-term pastorate over and over? Another step to having that positive pastor relationship is to communicate honestly, often, and kindly. Sometimes we do yearly reviews and things bottle up and wait until 12 months have gone by and the small issue has become a festering injury. And so to communicate honestly, often, and kindly, to talk about things as they happen as leadership and pastor, rather than to bottle them up and talk about them 5 years down the road when it's almost too hard to recover. The other is to remember Martin Luther's 8th commandment, that we are called to put the best construction on the things our neighbors, our friends, our pastors, our congregation members do. And so when we approach our pastor, when we as pastor approach our congregation, to put the best construction on what's happening, rather than to assume the worst at the very first moment. Another way that we can have a positive pastor and congregational relationship is to recognize how wide and broad a pastor's call is, especially for our solo pastors. You have folks who are working with preschoolers sometimes in Sunday school and in the children's sermon. And at the same time, we're hoping that same pastor is good at the end of life, in the nursing home, in the hospital. That is a really broad spectrum of gifts and personality. We're asking especially our solo pastors, but sometimes our pastors on staffs, to be really good at administration and details and keeping a calendar and supervising staff. But we're also asking them to be relational and connect with people at the cafe, when there's coffee hour after church. We hope we can have somebody who leads great adult Bible studies, but also is good with our 8th graders in confirmation. And so a pastor, especially a solo pastor, has a wide and broad call. One of the gifts we can give each other is recognizing where in that wide and broad call your pastor has gifts and where you as a congregation could marshal support for that person. In my former call, I followed a pastor who had been there 31 years, and he was very personable. He was very intellectual. Details, he would even say, were not his skill. And so the congregation rallied leadership around him that were very, very good at meticulous details and planning and keeping track of those pieces. So to recognize how wide and broad that call is, and to see where your pastor might need the strengths of your lay leaders in filling in what they may struggle with a bit more. Then remember that each pastor comes with their own unique personality, gifts, and growing edges. No two pastors come to you the same. They come with maybe a more introverted style or a more outgoing style. They may come loving music. They may come loving high worship or maybe more casual worship. But every pastor is a little bit different. And if you were to go between congregations on a Sunday, even with all our congregations reading the same readings, with all our congregations doing the same kind of liturgical seasons, our congregations have their own personality too. And it's amazing to see how different and life-giving that can be in each place. So remember that as you call a new pastor, especially, they will not be like your last pastor. They will be themselves. They will be different with their own unique personality, their own unique gifts, but also their own growing edges. Another piece is to support your pastor, pray for your pastor, and encourage your pastor. On those hard days of ministry where a young person in the community has passed away, several of our pastors are dealing with this recently. Support your pastor. Maybe send them a card that says you're thinking about them. Maybe show up with pie and leave it on their doorstep. But during those difficult times, support your pastor, encourage your pastor. During those days that are good and celebratory, let them know the things that are going well. We all know that the one negative comment can stay with us for months, but the positive comments we tend to forget a little quicker. And so to remember to encourage, to make those positive comments and pray for your pastor. Your pastors are praying for you, and it is a wonderful thing for you to say in a card or even verbally, I'm praying for you today. Some practical reminders. For all our pastors, whether new or long time in their calls, most of our pastors have one day off during the week. And so to respect your pastor's day off as much as possible. This has gotten a little bit harder in the world of social media and cell phones and texting, where sometimes we like to send something in a text so we don't forget it. And we send it at 9 o'clock on a Monday night as your pastor is off for the day. And immediately their mind and heart work back into congregational life. One of the things we're hearing in congregational leaders and from some of our pastors is, especially through COVID, they're beginning to get tired. And so finding ways to encourage that pastor to take their day off. Sometimes in our small communities for pastors, that means driving away to go to get groceries in a place they might not see people they know. It might mean encouraging them to go on a hike somewhere, go fishing, but to take that time off and to respect your pastor's day as much as possible. Honor the agreements in your letter of call regarding the things like continuing education time and vacation time or other pieces. As you put together your letter of call, it's pretty standard for a pastor to have 2 weeks of continuing education time, 4 weeks of vacation time. Help them take that. During COVID, I know there are some pastors who felt that they were the technology support in their congregations and they didn't know how quite they could get away. And so honor those agreements in your letter of call, help them to know they can get away, maybe find the people to help fill the pulpit when they're gone, and let them do those things that have been agreed to. Also honor your financial agreements with your pastor. For example, paying your pastor on the designated payday or paying their portico insurance as expected. Some congregations have a habit of mailing their checks to their pastors. Some do direct deposit, some leave the check on the desk for them on Sunday, but paying attention to the payday for your pastor, especially if you're mailing them, because they have gotten lost in the mail or delayed sometimes. And for your pastor, that is one of those pieces of knowing they're appreciated and knowing that they are in working partnership with you. Also for your pastors, portico is one of the things that many of our congregations use for insurance. Remember to pay those pieces so that your pastor doesn't get a surprise note that says it is not being paid. Nothing will panic a pastor more than hearing that their insurance is not being paid. So to pay attention to those pieces, especially as your pastor is paying attention to caring for folks who may be sick and ill. So the road ahead. There will be joys and celebrations in your journey with your future pastor. There will be bumps, there will be twists and turns, some things you never expected. Think back 10 years ago, you probably never would have expected journeying through COVID with your pastor. There will be grace, there will be forgiveness, there will be growth for your pastor and for you as a congregation. There will be unexpected things, and God will be there in your midst. So as we think about all of these, those are some common sense, many of them just very small reminders about building a positive relationship with your pastor. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and pull us back up. If you would share in chat, those of you who have the ability, if you would share some things that have been positive for you, either as you've started with a pastor or if you are a pastor, what things have made a start positive for you? It's very quiet. Anyone able to share? Oh, a basket filled with a variety of gift cards to community places. Weekly check-ins with the president, that open and honest, frequent communication. Any other things? Help moving in, definitely, especially if you have lots of big things and not big family. Help moving in. Food. If the congregation doesn't have a pictorial directory, take photos of people along with fun information to pass along to the pastor. Leaders who back up decisions we've made together. Amen. Any other ideas for having a good start?
Heather, can I just add on to my comment in the chat?
Mhm.
Repeatedly, we see, let's say it's the issue about vacation or a visiting policy, where the pastor and the council, let's say, come to an agreement about what it's going to be, and then there's someone unhappy, because there's always someone unhappy. There's always people in the congregation who love the pastor, and there's always people who don't so much. And so they go and complain to the council, and the council says, well, we don't know, you got to talk to the pastor about that. No. Say, this was a mutual decision. We're supportive of this. You don't have a problem with the pastor, you have a problem with us. So let's talk about that.
Definitely. And to honor what's in the contract, right? Most of our congregations have councils that switch over every 3 years. And if a pastor comes and you've written into your letter of call that there's a sabbatical every 5 or 7 years, and your council changes over, but the new council doesn't remember that there's a sabbatical policy, remember to honor those things that you've honored and written down in your call with the pastor. And Andy put, the congregation had a series of small gatherings called Pie with the Pastor for us to get to know people. Absolutely. And I think what we hear from some of our colleagues who started during COVID and you couldn't eat or have groups together was the loss of that, right? The loss of being able to sit at a table with coffee and treats and get to know each other better.
I can't remember the wording on the definition of compensation on that second page where it has something along the lines of what we want our new pastor to focus on, or expected. I can't remember. And then there's the part for the congregation, but to have those filled in rather than you have something in there rather, and this goes back to one of your earlier slides, but to be very clear, this is what we hope that you will focus on. It can't be a guessing game, and then get upset with the pastor a year and a half down the road when they're not doing what they didn't know you wanted them to do.
Well, if I could come in on that, those things will change. It'll be out of date in 12 months. So maybe part of the annual ministry review process is, what do we all agree we're all going to be working on this year? Council's going to work on this, education, pastor's going to work on this. And it becomes a mutual agreement that we're all have our piece to work on.
And if you've heard the quote, love is like bread, we make it new every day, right? The sense of a pastor parish relationship is new, it evolves. And so honoring those things that we need a pastor to do, we want a pastor to do, the ways we'll support them, but knowing that it changes. Most of our pastors never would have guessed they were going to be the video editors for worship videos, right? And so how does that come into play as things change in a congregation or setting? Any other thoughts or questions?
I have a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the best thing to do is to be open and talk about things before they get way to the right. If you can, a lot of small problems grow into big ones when you're not addressing them. And if we can address them right away, I think you can nip it in the bud and work through it and get along. Because that's what we need to do if we're going to continue. We have a small parish, and you need to work together. It's like a marriage. You have to work at it every day. And if you don't, it's going to fall apart.
Mhm.
That's all I got to say. Thank you.
And talk about it openly, right? Not just at coffee and then go and say, 3 of us were at coffee talking, and now we're coming to you, either as council leadership or as pastor, but to talk about it openly, not behind kind of the back or in the community, in places where it will leak back to the person that's being communicated about.
Bishop Debe has something to add to this, because I know she's worked on this issue. Let me just talk about mutual ministry committees. They can be the greatest blessing to a pastor in the congregation that's ever been, or they could be nothing but trouble, dangerous, places of explosion. And there's no middle ground in my experience. They're either one or the other. And it all comes down to how they're designed. Really helpful book for this whole area is from Augsburg Fortress called Pastor and People, or Pastor and People. It gets into everything, how to design a mutual ministry committee, how to set mutual goals together, how to do evaluations of effectiveness. It's really worth getting into. Dee, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah. And a mutual ministry committee or team is different than a personnel committee. It functions differently than the council. A personnel committee really works with evaluation and review. The mutual ministry committee thinks about how our ministry is going together. So we're in this mutually and can serve the function of spiritual nurture, a relational group, and not a support group, not a therapy group, but together taking kind of the balcony view of our ministry and asking, how's it going? And what are we seeing and hearing out there? And how can we work together to work mutually? So kind of scanning what's happening on the ground, and then maybe leading to something that actually goes to the council as something to study.
But can't underline enough, they are in no way involved with things like setting salary and compensation or doing annual evaluations. They are
Right.
not the complaint department. They need to know very well when someone comes and says, well, you're in a mutual ministry committee, you need to talk to a pastor about this. They need to know how to redirect that clearly, unequivocally.
And the book Pastor Steve mentioned is just the best guide for this.
Any other reflections or questions or comments?
Would you repeat the name of that book?
Hold on a second.
I think it's The Pastor and People.
Pastor and People, Making Mutual Ministry Work. It's in a Congregational Leaders series published by Augsburg. The whole series is very good, but this is just aces.
Steve, can you show the cover of the book?
Now that may be a mirror image, but
Oh, that's it. I think one of the things that we've seen in the last 2 years also is the ability of pastors to work from a home office for part of the time. And we've discovered that this works. And so talking together in your congregation, or your council or call committee relationship with the pastor about what mutual expectations and hopes for that are. Some things can only be done in the office. Some things can only be done in hospital. But we're finding, especially for those of us who live in the North Country, that home office becomes a real gift and a really helpful way to schedule meetings as well when people are not healthy and able to stay safe, but continue to communicate.
Let me just mention two things that I have heard when I'm talking to pastors, inviting them to interview for a call. Two things that the congregation can have in place that cost the congregation next to nothing, but are a huge positive for the pastor. What is a sabbatical policy? Our Synod guidelines describes how that can be arranged in a way that essentially costs the congregation nothing, because the key is picking the time of year and putting together a plan. And the other is parental leave. I've had a number of pastors who are in the age where they may want to have more kids and simply will not consider a call that doesn't have that box checked for a parental leave policy. And the idea, well, we'll talk about it later. It's not going to fly, because that means it's going to be a battle. The pastor will have to go with hat in hand to ask, and there'll be resistance. No, those are some things that you can take responsibility for ahead of time. Take the initiative on it. Well, Heather, I wonder if we should invite Bishop D to give a few closing thoughts and pray us out.
I'm happy to do that. One of the joys and honors that we have as Synod staff is presiding for ordinations and installations. And during that installation service, there is such sense of excitement. This is a day that the pastor and congregation have awaited for a long time. There's high anticipation for the future, and we are excited about what is beginning, the new relationship that's beginning. In the service of installation, these are two of the very powerful statements of commitment that pastor and congregation make to each other. So we ask the pastor, Pastor, in the presence of this assembly, will you commit yourself to this new trust and responsibility in the confidence that it comes from God through the call of the church? And the pastor says, I will, and I ask God to help me. The beautiful line that we ask the congregation is this: people of God, will you receive this pastor as a messenger of Jesus Christ, sent to serve all people with the gospel of hope and salvation? Will you regard him or her as a servant of Christ and a steward of the mysteries of God? St. Paul uses that term, a steward of the mysteries of God, saying we are servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. This has to do with, of course, the word and sacrament, but also the mystery of human community and how it is that we grow into loving relationships with one another. When a congregation is gathered together on Sunday morning, we could never expect that this diverse collection of human beings could be put together by God as a congregation that loves one another, and that with our different opinions and ideas and lives, that we could love one another in the congregations where God's placed us, and yet we do. St. Paul is right. It is a mystery, and we are all stewards of this mystery of human community, stewards of these relationships. We want to thank you for being here tonight and thinking more deeply about these relationships. We want to thank you for your ministry as leaders and as pastors of congregations. What you are doing every day matters, and we are so grateful for your leadership. We give thanks to God for you. Let's pray. Oh, Ever-living God, we praise and thank you for the resurrection that we celebrate this week. And we ask you, oh God, to strengthen and sustain congregations and pastors, that with mutual love and care for your people, they may give you glory and truly steward the gift of community you have given us. Grant that together we might follow the way of Jesus, our Savior and Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Thank you, friends. Go in peace. Keep on serving the risen Lord. Thanks be to God.
And if you haven't registered for the Synod Assembly yet, you could do so.
Thank you, Pastor Steve. Thank you, Pastor Heather. What a great evening.
Thank you.